Folks around Dry Valley always swore the old trails never forgot the sound of a real cowboy's boots. Some said the land itself carried memories of every rider who ever dared to test his grit against the dust, the wind, and the long stretches of loneliness. That morning, as the sun rose over the far hills with a slow burn, the wind carried a different kind of story. It carried the return of a man most thought had hung up his saddle for good. His name was Colt Avery, a rider known from one ridge to the next for hands that once roped wild horses and rebuilt broken fences faster than any man alive. He had vanished for a season, letting time settle on his shoulders heavier than he liked to admit, but now he was back, riding toward a ranch that needed more help than pride would allow it to say. The trouble started when the Brunson Ranch lost half its workmen to a winter fever. The only one left holding the place together was a fiery woman named Laura Kane, a rancher's daughter who had carried more weight than any woman her age should have. Folks respected her strength, but ranching was ranching, and cattle didn't care whether a man was sick or the barn roof was falling apart. They still needed tending. When word spread that Laura had nearly lost 2 calves during the last storm, the elders whispered that she needed a real hand at her side. But Laura, stubborn as wild sagebrush, said she could handle it. So when Colt Avery returned to Dry Valley, dust on his coat and a quiet fire in his eyes. Nobody knew what brought him back until he rode straight into Laura's ranch yard. She stepped out from the barn with her sleeves rolled up and hay tangled in her braid, looking at him like she was squaring up to a challenge. She had known him when she was younger, though back then he had seemed untouchable, the kind of cowboy who carried half the West in the way he moved. Now he stood older, broader, marked by the years but not defeated by them. If anything, he looked steadier than most men half his age. Laura crossed her arms with a sharp breath and said the words every cowboy in the valley would have taken as a spark to dry grass. She told him, plain as daylight, that he was too old for ranch work. Too old for rounding cattle, too old for chasing storms, too old for fixing the heavy mess she had on her hands. If she meant it as a warning, she misjudged the man in front of her. Colt's mouth curved in a slow smirk that carried more confidence than bragging, more grit than pride. He looked at her with eyes that had seen sun, snow, and enough hardship to know what a person was truly capable of. He told her she should watch what his hands could still do. The yard fell silent for a moment, birds pausing mid-call like even they wanted to see what would happen next. Laura felt her face flush with annoyance, though deep inside a tug of curiosity pulled at her. She didn't want help, especially not from someone who might bring old memories she had locked away. But the ranch was falling apart faster than she could hammer it back together. Fences were collapsing, water troughs were cracking, and the herd was restless from lack of strong guidance. She didn't want to admit it, but she needed a seasoned cowboy more than she liked to say. Still, letting Colt stay meant letting a part of her past walk through her doors again. And she wasn't sure she was ready to face that. The wind picked up, brushing dirt across Colt's boots as he unsaddled his horse like he had already decided he was staying. Laura stepped forward and told him she hadn't agreed to anything. But before she finished, the ground gave a sharp tremor. Both of them looked at the east fence line, where a section had snapped in the night. Behind it, 3 of the younger steers had pushed through and were making their way toward the thornbrush ravine. Laura's heart sank, knowing once they reached the ravine, they'd scatter across miles and she might not see them again before she could grab her rope. Colt was already mounted, boots firm in the stirrups. His horse charged with the same energy he had always carried into the saddle. Laura shouted that he didn't know the new land routes, but Colt rode out with a command in his posture that proved he hadn't forgotten a single trail around that ranch. She stood there watching him cut across the field with a speed that defied every word she had thrown at him. The sight stirred something she didn't want to name. Laura chased after him on foot, reaching the broken fence just in time to see Colt maneuver the steers away from the ravine. It took skill, timing, and a steady hand, and he worked the reins like the land had whispered instructions to him. When he returned, driving the steers back inside the yard with a single sweep of his arm, Laura found herself speechless. Colt dismounted without boasting, wiped the sweat off his brow, and nodded toward the herd as if he had only lifted a fallen bucket. She tried to hide her shock, but her pride was already cracking like old wood in a storm. She finally thanked him, though her voice carried more hesitation than gratitude. Colt didn't comment on it. Instead, he asked her what she had planned for the next repairs. Something in his tone made her feel like she was being seen through, not judged, just understood. She didn't like it, but she didn't turn away either. As they walked back toward the barn, she noticed how the morning sun broke across his shoulders, lighting the lines of a man who had lived enough, lost enough, and yet still showed up when someone needed help. The day stretched long, and Colt helped her mend the broken fence, tighten the corral gate, and patch a corner of the barn roof that had been rattling for weeks. He worked steady, not rushing, not trying to impress, just doing what needed to be done. Laura watched him from time to time, fighting an unfamiliar twist in her chest. He wasn't the same cowboy she remembered from years back. He was stronger in a quieter way, carrying a kind of steadiness that made the air around him feel more anchored. But as evening shadows grew, something unsettled began to show itself on the far edge of the ranch. Tracks appeared near the north pasture, tracks Colt recognized instantly. They weren't from cattle, horses, or anything natural to the ranch. Someone had been watching the place. Someone had walked the fence line while Laura slept. The prints were deep enough to show intent, light enough to show caution. Colt crouched down, tracing the dirt with those same hands Laura had doubted hours earlier. When she asked what it meant, he stood with a look that made her heart thrash like a startled horse. Colt told her someone wasn't just passing through. Someone was waiting for the right moment to strike. Laura felt a chill rise up her spine as Colt turned his eyes toward the darkening hills. There was something he wasn't saying, something he had noticed that stopped him from stepping away from her ranch. She didn't know what danger was coming or why Colt seemed to recognize it so quickly. What she did know was that the ranch wasn't as alone as she thought. Trouble was closer than she imagined, and Colt Avery might be the only person who understood the shape of that danger, and just as she was about to ask him what he feared the most, Colt lifted his head toward the wind, listening to something she couldn't hear. His jaw tightened. His shoulders squared. His voice lowered. He said they weren't alone anymore. The moment Colt said they weren't alone anymore, the ranch seemed to fall under a different kind of silence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet Laura knew so well. This one felt tense, like the whole land was holding its breath, waiting for something neither of them could see yet. Laura glanced toward the hills, but the sky was turning orange with the last stretch of daylight, making everything look softer than it really was. Colt didn't move. His hand hovered just above the fence post, as if he didn't want to draw attention even to that small sound. She had known him long enough, even through faded memories, to understand that when Colt Avery went quiet, something serious was stirring. She asked him what he heard, but he didn't answer right away. He stepped forward slowly, studying the ground the same way a scout reads a trail. Laura followed, though each step made her nerves twist tighter. The earth near the fence was marked with prints she hadn't noticed. She had been too busy working, too tired from long nights, too used to watching cattle instead of people. Colt pointed to the prints with a steady finger. They were deeper on the heels than the toes, which told him the person had been walking slow but heavy, someone cautious but burdened or maybe carrying something. The spacing between each step was wide enough to suggest confidence. Whoever it was, they hadn't been wandering. They had been tracking. Laura asked if it could be one of the ranch hands who had left during the winter sickness. Someone just checking on the old place? Colt shook his head. These prints were fresh. Too fresh. He said they were made after the storm 2 nights earlier. That meant someone had been watching recently, maybe even that day. Her stomach tightened as she felt a cold ribbon of fear curl inside her. If someone was watching from the hills, waiting for darkness, it could only mean trouble she hadn't prepared for. Colt's voice softened when he told her not to panic. He wasn't brushing off the danger, but he wanted her steady, not scattered. He reminded her that ranchland often attracted drifters, men who didn't mean harm but were looking for a place to camp. But Laura could tell by the shift in his tone that he didn't believe it was a harmless wanderer. He knew something she didn't, something he wasn't quite ready to reveal. As they walked back toward the barn, Laura's mind drifted to the months before Colt had returned to Dry Valley. She had taken over the ranch after her father passed, holding the reins with hands that were strong, but still learning the weight of real responsibility. Laura had grown up watching her father, Reed Kane, teach horses to settle their spirits and cattle to follow his lead. He was a man whose voice carried calm even in storms. When the fever swept through the valley, she had sat beside him night after night until the illness took him. After that, every board on the ranch felt heavier. Every task felt twice as long, and every mile of fence felt like it stretched into forever. The ranch had once been full of noise. Laughter of ranch hands, clatter of tools, horses stirring before dawn. Now it was mostly her voice echoing through the empty yard. She had never feared the work, but she feared the silence. It didn't help that rumors had whispered through the valley. Folks talked about a group of men drifting through nearby towns, men who kept their faces low and their horses restless. Laura had ignored the talk, thinking it wouldn't reach her land. Now she wasn't sure. Inside the barn, Colt checked the tools, inspecting the worn handles of hammers, the frayed rope coils, the rust creeping on the hinges of the back stall door. He moved the way a man does when he's looking for something out of place, not tools but signs of intrusion. Laura watched him, noting how his shoulders tightened every time he spotted something that didn't sit right. When he looked at the hayloft ladder, she noticed it too. The bottom rung had fresh cracks. Someone heavy had stepped on it recently. Laura felt fire rise in her chest. She asked Colt why someone would sneak around her ranch. What would they want? The land was tired, the herd smaller than it once was, the barn roof barely holding on. But Colt reminded her that land was land, and even dry acres had value to the wrong kind of men. He told her that some groups moved from ranch to ranch looking for easy takings, supplies, horses, or a vulnerable place they could claim before the owner had a chance to fight back. Laura swallowed hard. Vulnerable. That word slapped at her pride. She wasn't weak. She wasn't helpless. But the truth was hard to deny. She was alone out here. And her ranch looked like easy prey. Colt wasn't trying to shame her. He was trying to tell her she wasn't imagining the danger. He walked closer, lowering his voice as if the walls themselves might be listening. He explained that before he left Dry Valley months ago, he had crossed paths with a man named Creed Talbot, a drifter with cold eyes and a reputation that followed him like a shadow. Creed and his men had been moving across the valley, picking at small ranches, taking what they wanted, never staying long enough for lawmen to catch them. Colt had warned the town elders, but he left before he knew whether they took his warning to heart. If Creed Talbot was near her ranch, if those prints belonged to him or his men, then the danger was far worse than Laura imagined. She asked Colt why he thought it was Creed. Colt didn't say it outright, but Laura saw the flicker in his eyes, the one he tried to hide. He had seen something in those tracks, something familiar, something that matched the way Creed moved. Colt wasn't guessing. He was remembering. The barn lanterns glowed warm as the sun finally fell behind the hills. The night air rolled in colder than before. Laura and Colt stood near the stalls, the dim light flickering off their faces. Colt told her they had to secure the ranch before darkness settled deep. He handed her tools and walked her through, reinforcing the gate, checking hinges, tightening boards, tying knots that would hold even under pressure. Laura worked beside him, matching his pace. Her hands steady, even though her heart wasn't. The work gave her a chance to observe him quietly. Colt wasn't the kind of man who exaggerated danger. He had the calmness of someone who had faced enough of it to know when to take it seriously. His movements were deliberate, not rushed. His voice low, not shaken. Every now and then he paused and looked toward the dark hills. The same hills where shadows now moved like quiet watchers, as they walked the outer fence line with a lantern. Laura asked him why he came back to Dry Valley after being gone so long. The question sounded more personal than she meant it to be, but it hung between them like a rope tied to something unexplored. Colt didn't answer right away. He kept walking, boots crunching softly over dirt, lantern swinging against his leg. Then he said he came back because something told him the valley wasn't done with him yet. He didn't give details, didn't mention the past they shared or the look she gave him earlier when he saved the steers. Something told her his reason was deeper than he let on. Before she could press him, the lantern light caught something on the ground near the far gate. Both of them froze. It wasn't a track this time. It was a torn scrap of fabric caught under a wooden plank. Colt picked it up, turned it in his hand, then looked at Laura with a heaviness that made her pulse jump. It wasn't from her clothes. It wasn't from anything on the ranch. Someone had been closer than the fence line, much closer. Colt tucked the fabric into his coat and told her to stay near him until sunrise. The way he said it left no room for argument. The night carried too many unknowns, too many shadows, too many chances for trouble to step closer. As they crossed the yard toward the house, Laura felt the weight of the ranch surrounding her, every corner now holding a question. She had always believed she could handle everything on her own, but tonight the land felt different. Colt walked beside her, steps strong, eyes sharp. She didn't know what danger was coming or what Creed Talbot wanted, or why Colt had returned just in time, but she knew. One thing with absolute certainty, the night wasn't going to pass quietly, and whatever waited out. There in the shadows was getting ready to make its first move. Night laid itself across the Branson ranch like a heavy blanket, thick and watchful. The house sat in the middle of that wide darkness with only a faint glow slipping through the front window. Laura moved from room to room, checking shutters, testing the locks she had never bothered with before. Every creak of floorboard made her nerves jump. Out in the yard, Colt's shadow moved past the window now and then. He was making a slow circle of the main buildings, a quiet guard moving under the dim shine of the moon. Inside the kitchen, Laura's hands went through the familiar motion of setting the stove for coffee. Though her stomach had no interest in food or drink, the scent of beans was just a comfort from old days. Her father always said a pot on the stove meant home was still standing no matter what the wind was doing outside. She clung to that thought now. Even as fear clawed at the back of her mind, she carried 2 chipped mugs to the table and waited for Colt to come in from his patrol. When he finally stepped through the doorway, the room seemed to steady around him. Dust clung to his boots and his coat, and his face looked more tired in the lamplight, but his eyes still held that sharp alertness that made her both grateful and uneasy. He shut the door behind him, testing it once more with a firm pull before sitting across from her. Laura slid a mug toward him, watching him wrap his hands around it. She remembered those hands from years back when he used to help her father break stubborn colts. Back then they had seemed untouchable, steady as mountains. Now they were rougher, marked by time, but somehow even more certain. She could still hear herself telling him he was too old for ranch work, and the memory made her cheeks burn. Colt took a slow sip, then set the cup down and asked if anyone else knew she often stayed alone at the ranch. Laura hesitated before answering. She knew some folks in town talked more than they should. After her father passed, a few neighbors offered to send help, but she turned them down. She did not want pity. She did not want people thinking she could not handle her own land. She admitted that she often rode into town alone, handled supply orders, and came back late with only the stars for company. Colt listened without judgment, but the tightness in his jaw deepened. He told her that men like Creed Talbot looked for patterns. They watched who rode where and when. They looked for the one place where the doors stayed unguarded. If Creed thought Laura was alone, that made her ranch his kind of target. Laura's anger flared. She hated the idea of being seen as prey. She told Colt she would fight if she had to. She had her father's old rifle and she knew how to use it. Colt did not doubt her courage. He knew better than anyone that bravery was not in question. The problem was numbers. Creed never rode alone. Where there was one track, there were usually 3 or 4 waiting behind it. The thought of strangers pushing into her yard, her barn, her home, made Laura's chest clamp tight. She reached for strength in the only way she knew how. She asked Colt what he knew from his time on the trail. Had he faced Creed before? What kind of man was he dealing with? Colt did not answer right away. His gaze drifted to the window, where the night pressed against the glass. After a moment, he told her the truth in pieces. He had first met Creed Talbot down near the border, in a rough camp where men came to trade broken horses and stolen goods. Colt had gone there tracking a stray herd, thinking the worst he might find was a few dishonest dealers. Instead he found Creed, a man with a smooth voice and cold eyes, sitting at the center of the camp like a spider in a web. Creed carried no real trait of his own. He lived off what others took. He had a way of turning men restless, of making them believe they deserved whatever they could steal from. Those who worked harder than they ever would. Colt had clashed with Creed when he discovered 2 horses from a widow's ranch among the stolen animals. He demanded they be returned. Most men would have backed down in a camp full of thieves, but Colt did not. His father had taught him that a man's line was drawn where the weak were being robbed. That day, Colt walked away with the widow's horses, but not without a mark. Creed never forgot the humiliation of being put in his place in front of his own men. From then on, Creed had a reason to follow Colt's trail, waiting for the day something or someone Colt cared about would stand unprotected. Laura listened in chilled silence as Colt admitted that coming back to Dry Valley was not only about unfinished business with the land. It was about a nagging sense that Creed would one day ride this way. Looking to settle that old score, the room felt smaller after that confession. Laura realized her ranch was not only in danger because she was alone. It was in danger because of who had just walked back into her life. She wanted to be angry at him for bringing that kind of shadow to her door. But when she looked at Colt, she saw the weight he carried in his eyes. He had not come to hide behind her walls. He had come to stand between her land and that shadow, even if it cost him more than he was letting on. Before she could speak, a sudden thud came from outside near the back porch. Both of them froze. The sound was heavy, not like a branch falling or a loose board shifting. Colt stood up slow and reached for the rifle resting by the wall. He moved with a controlled calm that made Laura's heart thump harder. He motioned for her to stay behind him, but she shook her head and grabbed her father's rifle from its hooks anyway. They moved together toward the back door. The porch lantern swung in the breeze, casting long, warped shadows across the boards. The night air was colder here, carrying a faint scent of smoke from some distant camp. Laura's breath puffed out in small clouds as they stepped outside. The yard looked empty. The corral fence stood still. The barn loomed quiet. Yet the feeling of being watched clung to the air like fog. Colt signaled toward the side of the house, where the root cellar sat half hidden in the ground. As they edged closer, Laura saw what had made the noise. One of the cellar barrels lay tipped over, its lid rolled aside. It should have taken a strong push to knock it over. Wind alone would not have done it. Colt crouched and studied the dirt around the barrel. Laura saw it too this time. The prints were clearer here, heavier. Someone had been close enough to touch the house. Her mind raced. Had they been here while she and Colt sat at the table? Had they listened through the walls? A shiver shot down her spine. Colt rose slowly and scanned the darkness beyond the barn. He could not see anyone, but he knew better than to believe the yard was empty. Men like Creed did not rush. They tested first. They pressed at the edges, probing for weak spots. Tonight may only have been a warning. He led Laura back inside, closing the door with a soft click. Her legs felt unsteady, but anger was starting to burn through her fear. She was tired of feeling hunted on her own land. Back at the table, they spread out an old ranch map. Laura showed him where the land dropped into gullies, where the old creek bed twisted, where the north pasture met the low ridge that led toward town. Colt traced each line with the tip of a calloused finger, mapping not only the land but the likely paths of men who wanted to slip in unseen. He laid out a plan. They would move a portion of the herd to the smaller south pasture where the fences were tighter and the ground more open. They would set up noise traps along the north side, simple wire and tin that would rattle if anyone tried to cross. Laura would ride into town the next day under daylight, not to beg for help, but to pass quiet word to 2 men Colt trusted, RETRED drovers named Flint Harlan and Wade Cooper. Colt had ridden trails with them years back. They knew trouble when they saw it, and they owed him favors. Laura bristled at the idea of involving others. She did not want the town thinking she could not hold her own. Colt reminded her that even the strongest rancher knew when to call on a neighbor. Her father had followed that rule. He spoke Reed Kane's name with respect, and that softened Laura's resistance. If her father would not have faced this alone, she could not cling to pride now. Another small storyline quietly unfolded behind all that planning. As they worked over the map, their hands brushed more than once. Each touch was brief, accidental, yet charged with something they both pretended not to notice. Laura found herself studying Colt's face when he looked away, tracing the lines of a man who had given much of his life to this land and had almost walked away from it for good. Colt, in turn, watched how Laura handled the map, how she spoke of every acre like it was a part of her. The bond between them grew in the space between danger and duty. Though neither one gave it voice, outside the night deepened. Somewhere beyond the far ridge, a campfire burned where unseen men warmed their hands and whispered over their own rough map of the valley. Creed Talbot likely sat among them, listening to his scouts describe the ranch, the woman, and the older cowboy who had stepped back into the picture. He would not be pleased to hear Colt Avery's name, but for a man like Creed, anger was just fuel. It would make him more careful, not less. Back in the house, the clock on the shelf ticked slow and steady, marking a long stretch of sleepless hours. Colt told Laura to lie down for a while. He would take first watch near the front window. She wanted to refuse, wanted to stay awake and stand guard beside him, but her body had other plans. Exhaustion tugged at her bones. She finally agreed to rest in the small room off the kitchen. Leaving her boots by the door and her rifle within reach, she lay on the narrow bed. Staring at the ceiling, Laura listened to the faint sounds of Colt moving in the next room. His boots on the floorboards, the soft scrape of a chair as he settled near the window, the quiet click as he checked the rifle one more time. Those sounds wrapped around her like a thin shield. For the first time in many nights, she did not feel completely alone in the dark. Sleep eventually pulled her under, but it was not peaceful. Her dreams filled with rushing hooves, shadowed men, and the sound of boards splintering under strong hands. Through it all, she kept seeing Colt standing at the gate, facing a figure she could not quite see. When she reached for him in the dream, her hand closed on nothing. She jolted awake sometime before dawn, heart racing. The house was still dark, the lamps burned low. For a moment she thought something had gone wrong. Then she heard it, Colt's voice, low and tense. Speaking from the front room, not to himself, to someone standing just outside the door. The voice at the front door was deep, rough, and carried the kind of steadiness that made Laura freeze where she lay. She could not make out the words, only the low rumble of speech followed by Colt's controlled reply. Her heart thudded like a hammer as she pushed herself up, grabbed her boots without tying them, and slipped quietly toward the kitchen doorway. Colt's shadow stretched across the floor, tall and still as stone. He held his rifle angled low but ready, his posture calm in a way that only came from a lifetime of facing danger head-on. Laura edged close enough to see a figure through the thin curtains. A lone rider stood on the porch, hat brim low, shoulders broad, the faint glow of dawn beginning to touch the sky behind him. The man was not pushing the door or shouting threats. He simply stood there like someone who knew he had no reason to hurry. That calmness frightened Laura more than anger ever could. Colt asked him what he wanted, voice steady but firm. The man outside shifted slightly, enough for the lantern light to catch his face. Laura recognized him at once. Flint Harlan, one of the two drovers Colt had planned to send word to. Relief washed over her for a brief moment, but then she noticed the look in Flint's eyes. He was not relaxed. He was not here for morning coffee. Something troubled him. Flint said he had ridden through the ridge at first light and spotted 3 camps in the distance, each tucked behind different slopes. He had counted at least a dozen horses, maybe more. Tracks told him the men were moving closer to the ranch during the night. He also said he found the remains of a small fire near the creek, fresh enough that the ashes were still warm. Whoever had been there was not far ahead of him. Laura stepped fully into the room, unable to stay hidden any longer. Flint tipped his hat to her but did not smile. He explained that Wade Cooper was riding the opposite side of the valley, covering the low trails, but they could not be everywhere at once. The men scouting the ridge were not strangers. They were the kind known for cutting fences and taking horses in the dark. Flint did not say Creed's name, but they all felt it hanging in the air. Colt motioned Flint inside quickly, shutting the door as soon as he crossed the threshold. The three of them gathered around the table, the ranch map spread open once again. Laura watched Colt's jaw clench as Flint traced the lines where he had seen movement. The camps were positioned to corner the ranch from two sides. If they closed in fully, there would be no clear escape path. Cole asked Flint why he had come straight to the ranch instead of circling back for Wade. Flint said he had spotted a rider on the ridge, following him for part of the way. He could not risk leading the man toward Wade or losing time doubling back. He chose to warn Colt first. His decision made sense, but it also meant the ranch had less time than they hoped. Laura stared at the map, feeling the walls of the valley tightening around them. She asked what the men were waiting for, if they had already surrounded the place. Flint exchanged a look with Colt, then said they were probably waiting for nightfall again. Men who wanted to take land or stock always preferred the dark. It gave them room to scatter the herd and confuse the owner. It gave them shadows to hide in. They were studying the ranch right now, choosing where to strike first. Colt pushed back from the table and paced a slow line across the room. Laura knew he was turning the problem over in his mind, searching for the weakest link. She also knew he would not leave her side no matter what danger came. That truth tightened something low in her chest. Colt finally stopped and said they needed to move the herd sooner than planned. If the men aimed to stampede the cattle, they would have nothing left by morning. Flint offered to help drive the herd into the south pasture. He said Wade would join once he circled back, assuming he had not run into trouble of his own. Colt agreed, but he warned Flint to keep his eyes sharp. Their enemies would not sit idle while they moved. Laura grabbed her coat and rifle and said she was riding too. Colt hesitated, but he saw the fire in her eyes. This was her land. She would not hide while others fought for it. He nodded, though worry flickered in his gaze. He told her to stay between him and Flint at all times. No matter how things unfolded, they saddled their horses quickly, the morning sky still dim but growing clearer by the minute. Mist hung low over the fields, making every fence post look like a lone sentinel. When they reached the herd, the cattle were restless, noses raised, tails flicking at shadows. Animals always knew when danger hovered near. Laura rode alongside Colt as they began pushing the herd south, the sound of hooves rolling through the valley like distant thunder as they worked. Laura noticed movement far across the ridge. A flicker of light. A small reflection. Someone watching them? She called out to Colt, pointing toward the hills. He narrowed his eyes and saw it too. A figure on horseback, still but unmistakable. The watcher did not approach. He simply observed their every move. Colt signaled Flint to take the left flank and keep the herd tight. He moved closer to Laura, lowering his voice as he explained that the watcher was marking their positions, noting how many riders the ranch had. Laura felt her pulse quicken. Seeing the danger with her own eyes made everything more real. Colt leaned closer and told her not to break focus. The cattle came first. If they lost the herd, the ranch wouldn't last another season. They worked the herd into the south pasture, just as the sun finally broke over the hills. The light revealed tracks near the ridgeline, more than just one rider. Laura counted at least 4 trails, heavy and overlapping. Colt studied them from horseback, shoulders tense. He had seen enough to confirm what they feared. Creed's men were gathering in numbers. Flint rode up beside them, face grim. He said the men had shifted their positions during the drive. They were closing in. Wade had not appeared yet, and that worried them all. Laura tried to push down the fear rising in her chest. She told herself Wade was a seasoned drover, smart enough to avoid any traps. But even seasoned men could fall into the wrong hands when outnumbered. Colt suggested they reinforce the south gate while Flint circled to check the small ravine behind the pasture. Laura stayed with Colt, helping him adjust the heavy beams across the posts, tying new loops, and checking for weak wood. Her hands trembled once when she thought of Creed's men slipping into the ranch like wolves, but Colt placed a steady hand on hers. He told her fear was natural, but fear did not control the outcome. That belonged to what they did, not what they felt. Their work was interrupted by a distant echo across the valley. A sharp crack, faint but unmistakable. Laura jerked her head toward the sound. Flint was nowhere in sight. Colt mounted his horse instantly and told Laura to stay near the gate. She refused. She said she would not wait alone. Colt hesitated, torn between protecting her and finding Flint, but there was no time to argue. He motioned for her to follow, but warned her again to stay to his right. They rode hard across the pasture, hooves kicking dust behind them. The echo came again, clearer this time, a warning. Colt recognized it as a signal someone might use when trying to draw attention. Flint must have been trying to give them a direction. They crested the low hill and found Flint crouched beside a fallen log, waving them down. Laura dismounted and hurried toward him. He pointed toward the ravine where 3 riders moved along the ridge. They were not charging. They were testing the edges, searching for a weak point. Flint said he had nearly ridden into them. He had fired into the air to warn Colt. Laura felt a rush of relief that he was unharmed, but the tension in the air was beginning to choke her. Colt studied the riders, his eyes narrowing with calculation. He knew they would not attack in daylight, but their boldness meant something had shifted. Creed had grown tired of waiting. Colt said they needed to pull back to the ranch house and prepare for the evening. That was when the real test would come. Laura felt the weight of his words like a storm pressing down. As they rode back, she kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting the riders to break into a charge. But they remained on the ridge, silhouettes against the rising sun. They reached the house just as Wade Cooper finally appeared at the far fence, riding hard and waving them over. His horse was lathered in sweat. When he dismounted, his face looked tight with fear and anger. He said he had been followed halfway, across the valley by 2 riders who vanished once he reached higher ground. He was sure they had been driven off only because the valley grew too open for their liking. With all 4 gathered now, the tension in the yard thickened. The sun was rising higher, but instead of comfort, daylight brought clarity. They were surrounded. They were watched. And tonight, the valley would not sleep. Colt laid out the plan with firm resolve. Wade would take position near the barn loft. Flint would stay near the corral where the ground sloped most, and Colt would guard the house. Laura insisted she would not be sent inside. Colt did not argue this time. He simply placed her near the well where the stone wall would give her cover. She felt a mixture of gratitude and dread. By the time the sun touched noon, the valley had grown still. Birds stopped calling, the wind thinned. Even the cattle huddled close. Laura stood at the well, gazing at the horizon, her rifle cradled in her hands. Colt stood a few steps away, watching the ridge with a stare that could cut stone, and then, as the air hung heavy and the valley held its breath, a single rider appeared on the far ridge. 1 man. Riding. Slow, riding straight toward the ranch. Colt's eyes narrowed. Laura's heart climbed into her throat. It was Creed Talbot. Creed Talbot rode toward the ranch with the slow confidence of a man who believed the land already belonged to him. Laura felt her stomach twist as she watched him approach, his dark coat dragging dust behind his horse, his posture straight and arrogant. Around her, the ranch held its breath. Wade stayed hidden near the barn loft with his rifle ready. Flint crouched near the corral, eyes fixed on the ridge in case any of Creed's men tried to ride in behind him. Colt stood closest to Creed's path, his shoulders squared, his calm steady as stone. Laura stayed near the well, protected by the stone wall, but close enough to see Colt's expression when Creed finally stopped in front of him. Creed slowed his horse and tilted his head, looking at Colt like they were meeting for a friendly morning chat instead of a standoff on a ranch he intended to take. He said Colt had always had a habit of showing up where he wasn't wanted, and he said it like he was talking about a small inconvenience instead of someone who once stood up to him in a camp full of thieves. Colt didn't take the bait. He told Creed plain and steady that the ranch wasn't his. The cattle weren't his, and if he thought he could walk in and take anything, he had misjudged the valley and the people in it. Creed's smile didn't reach his eyes. He talked about men getting older, their hands slowing, their strength fading. He said Colt should have stayed gone instead of coming back to protect a place he couldn't save. Creed's voice carried in the still air, digging at Colt's age, stirring the insult like he was trying to get a rise out of him. Laura saw Colt's jaw tighten, not with anger but with focus. Colt knew Creed's game. He wanted Colt to act rashly, to step out of position, to give Creed's hidden riders room to move. Colt didn't fall for it. He simply told Creed that age only made a man better at knowing when to hold his ground. Laura felt something spark in her chest. Those same hands Creed mocked were the hands that had saved her cattle, reinforced her walls, and stood guard through the night while she slept. She stepped closer, rifle in hand, no longer hiding behind the stone wall. Creed turned his eyes to her, studying her with the slow grin of a man who thought he had already won. He made a remark about the land being too big for one woman to run alone, and Laura felt every bit of fear she had carried turn into firm resolve. She told Creed she wasn't alone. She told him this land had belonged to her father before her, and that she wasn't giving 1 inch of it to a man who only understood taking. Her voice did not waver. For a moment, Creed's smile faltered. He hadn't expected her to stand tall. He certainly hadn't expected her to speak with that kind of fire. Colt's eyes flicked toward her, proud and worried at the same time, before Creed could answer. A whistle echoed across the ridge. It was sharp and unmistakable. Flint cursed under his breath. Wade shifted in the loft. Colt's posture changed immediately. Creed didn't even look surprised. That whistle was the signal. His men had moved into position. Creed leaned forward in the saddle and said he would give them 1 chance to walk away. Colt lifted his rifle just enough to show he was ready, but not foolish. He told Creed the same offer was waiting on him. Neither man blinked. Then in one swift motion, Creed pulled on his reins and shouted to his men behind the ridge. Horses burst onto the valley floor, hoofs pounding, dust rising in a fast-moving cloud. Laura's heart jumped into her throat. Flint fired a warning shot. Wade called out from the loft. Colt shouted for Laura to stay low. Everything happened at once. Riders thundered toward the ranch like a storm rolling in fast. But Colt had prepared for this. The noise traps rattled sharply as the riders crossed the wire. Their horses spooked, veering and stumbling. Flint and Wade spread their fire wide, aiming to scatter them, not harm. The sudden noise and sharp turns broke the first wave, sending men scrambling. Creed cursed loud enough for everyone to hear. He hadn't expected the traps, the defenses, or the determination in the valley. He tried to rally his men, but the confusion had already taken root. Colt stepped forward, calling Creed out by name and telling him that his men weren't loyal enough to die for a fight he couldn't win. It was true. The riders hesitated. Some pulled back. Some circled nervously. Creed's grip tightened on his reins as he realized he was losing control of the moment. Creed stared at Colt with a fury that burned hotter than the sun rising behind him. He moved as if he intended to charge Colt directly, but his horse jerked sideways, rattled by the traps and gunfire echoing across the yard. Colt didn't raise his rifle. He simply stood his ground, waiting for Creed to make a choice. Laura could hardly breathe as Creed looked from Colt to the ranch, then to the men still scrambling over the ridge. Finally, Creed spat into the dirt and shouted for his men to fall back. His voice cracked with anger and frustration. Some of the riders hesitated, but most were too spooked to stay. They retreated toward the ridge, horses kicking dust and stones behind them. Creed glared at Colt one last time, his eyes promising this wasn't finished. Then he rode off, disappearing over the hill, his men trailing behind him like defeated shadows. When the valley finally went quiet, Laura felt her knees weaken. The fear, the adrenaline, the long night of tension finally hit her all at once. Colt walked over to her, his face still tight with watchfulness. He asked if she was hurt. She shook her head, though her breath came unsteady. Flint and Wade approached, both shaken but unharmed. They said the riders were scattered enough that none would try circling back that day. The danger had passed for now. Laura looked out across the land, sunlight catching on the fields where her herd grazed safely. For the first time in days she felt the air loosen around her. Colt placed a hand gently on her shoulder and told her she had held her ground like a true rancher. She felt warmth rise through her chest, not just from victory, but from knowing she had not faced it alone. They spent the rest of the morning walking the land, checking the fences, settling the herd, and making sure no man had stayed behind. Flint and Wade stayed long enough to help mend the places where the traps had pulled the fence loose. When the work was done, they promised to watch the roads into the valley for a few days, just in case Creed tried to return. They shook Colt's hand firmly and tipped their hats to Laura with genuine respect before riding off Dop as the day softened into afternoon. Laura and Colt stood near the barn where the warm sun lit the dust hanging in the air. The quiet felt peaceful, not tense. She looked at Colt with a mix of gratitude and something deeper. Something that had grown slowly between them since the moment he rode back into Dry Valley. She told him she had been wrong when she said he was too old for ranch work. Colt gave her a slow smirk, the kind that always held a spark of challenge. He said he had been waiting for her to figure that out. She stepped closer, brushing a bit of dust from his sleeve. She told him he had saved more than just her ranch. He had reminded her what strength looked like. Not the loud kind. The steady kind that stands firm when everything feels uncertain. Colt took her hand softly, the same hands Creed had mocked, the same hands that had proven their worth 100 times over. He told her that every fight on this land was worth it. Because she was worth fighting beside, Laura felt her heart settle in a way it hadn't since her father passed. She knew danger could come again someday, but she also knew she wouldn't face it alone. Colt told her he wasn't planning on riding away this time. Dry Valley still had a place for him, and so did she as the sun dipped lower and painted the hills gold. Laura leaned against Colt, feeling the rhythm of his breathing. The strength in his arms, the steadiness that had carried her through the hardest trial of her life. The ranch stretched wide around them, safe again, its fences strong, its cattle calm, its future no longer hanging by a thread. Colt whispered that hands only grow better with time. Laura smiled and told him she knew that now more than ever. Together they stood watching the valley they had saved, the place that had brought them together, and the land they would build a new life on, and for the first time in a long while, the ranch felt like home again.